Sarah Martinez adjusted her navy blue dress one more time as she walked through the crowded parking lot of Pendleton High School. The June sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt, but nothing could dampen her spirits today. Her son Jake was graduating, and, after everything they had been through together, this moment felt like a small miracle. She had arrived early, wanting to secure a good seat where she could capture every moment of Jake's walk across the stage. At 18, he had grown into a young man she barely recognized from the scared little boy who used to hide behind her legs when strangers came around. His father's absence had shaped both of their lives in ways Sarah was still learning to understand, but Jake had risen above every challenge thrown his way. The auditorium buzzed with excited chatter as families filed in, searching for the perfect spots to witness their children's milestone moment. Sarah found herself scanning the crowd, noting the mix of emotions on parents' faces. Pride, nostalgia, worry about what came next, all painted across weathered and youthful faces alike. She understood every single expression. As she settled into her chosen seat 3 rows from the front, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in her phone screen. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had dropped Jake off for his first day of kindergarten 13 years ago. There were lines around her eyes now, earned through sleepless nights and countless worries. Her dark hair, once long and carefree, was now cut in a practical bob that she could manage between her 2 jobs. But her eyes still held the same fierce determination that had carried her through the darkest periods of single motherhood. The ceremony began with the traditional pomp and circumstance, graduates filing in wearing caps and gowns that made them all look older and younger at the same time. Sarah's heart swelled when she spotted Jake in the sea of blue, his broad shoulders and confident stride marking him as someone who belonged exactly where he was. She thought about all the nights she had helped him with homework at their small kitchen table, the times she had driven him to baseball practice even when gas money was tight, the conversations they had shared about dreams and futures. Jake had always been different from other kids his age. While they played video games and worried about social media likes, he spent hours reading military history books and watching documentaries about various branches of service. Sarah had initially worried about his fascination with military life, knowing too well the toll it could take on families. But, as Jake grew older, she realized that his interest stemmed not from a desire for conflict, but from a deep respect for service and sacrifice. The principal's voice echoed through the auditorium as he began calling names alphabetically. Sarah found herself holding her breath as they approached the M section, her phone ready to capture the moment Jake received his diploma. She had attended every school event she possibly could over the years, but work obligations had sometimes forced her to miss things that mattered to Jake. Today was different. Today she had taken the day off from both her morning job at the medical clinic and her evening shift at the restaurant. When Jake's name was finally called, Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she watched her son stride confidently across the stage. The young man shaking hands with the principal bore little resemblance to the shy child who had once been afraid of his own shadow. Military recruiters had been calling their house regularly for the past year, and Jake had already made his decision about which path he wanted to pursue after graduation. As the ceremony continued, Sarah noticed movement in her peripheral vision. A man in military dress uniform had taken a seat in the row behind her, his presence commanding attention even as he tried to remain inconspicuous. She could see the insignia marking him as a Marine Corps captain, and something about his bearing suggested he was here for more than just watching a relative graduate. Captain Michael Torres had been stationed at nearby Camp Pendleton for the past 3 years, and part of his duties included attending local events where potential recruits might be present. He took his recruitment responsibilities seriously, understanding that the young people he spoke with today could be the Marines who would serve alongside him tomorrow. But today felt different somehow, perhaps because he was thinking about his own future and the choices that had led him to this moment. As he settled into his seat, Michael's attention was drawn to the woman in front of him. There was something about the way she held herself, a kind of quiet strength that reminded him of the military spouses he had known throughout his career. She was clearly here for someone important, given the way she focused intently on the ceremony and kept her phone ready to capture every moment. The graduation progressed smoothly, with speeches about bright futures and unlimited potential. Michael found himself half listening to the familiar rhetoric, his mind wandering to his own high school graduation 15 years earlier. He had been so certain about his path then, so eager to serve his country and make a difference in the world. The years since had taught him that certainty was a luxury that rarely survived contact with reality. As the ceremony wound down and families began to mill about looking for their graduates, Sarah stood and stretched, her muscles stiff from sitting in the uncomfortable auditorium chairs. She was scanning the crowd for Jake when she felt someone approach from behind. "Excuse me," a deep voice said politely. "I couldn't help but notice how proud you looked during the ceremony. Is your son planning to continue his education or explore other options?" Sarah turned to find herself face to face with the Marine captain she had noticed earlier. Up close, she could see that he was probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. His uniform was immaculate, every detail perfect in the way that spoke of years of discipline and attention to detail. "He's already decided what he wants to do," Sarah replied carefully, unsure why this stranger was asking about Jake's plans. "He's been talking about military service for years now." Michael nodded approvingly. "That's excellent to hear. Which branch is he considering?" "I'm Captain Torres, and I'd be happy to answer any questions he might have about opportunities in the Marine Corps." Before Sarah could respond, Jake appeared at her side, having spotted the Marine uniform from across the crowded auditorium. His eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm Sarah had learned to recognize whenever military topics came up in conversation. "Mom, who's your friend?" Jake asked, though his attention was clearly focused on Captain Torres and the various ribbons and insignia adorning his dress uniform. "Jake, this is Captain Torres," Sarah said, watching as her son straightened unconsciously, his natural respect for military authority evident even in civilian clothes. "He was asking about your plans after graduation." Michael extended his hand to Jake, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested the young man had been raised with strong values. "Congratulations on your graduation. Your mother tells me you're interested in military service." "Yes, sir," Jake replied immediately. "I've been researching different options, but I keep coming back to the Navy SEALs. I know it's extremely difficult, but I've been preparing for years." Sarah felt a familiar pang of worry at the mention of SEALs training. She had done her own research into the various military specialties Jake had expressed interest in over the years, and she knew that SEAL training was among the most demanding and dangerous programs in the entire military. But she also knew that trying to talk Jake out of something he was passionate about would only strengthen his resolve. Captain Torres raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by Jake's directness about such an ambitious goal. "That's a serious commitment. SEAL training has one of the highest dropout rates in the military. What makes you think you're ready for that kind of challenge?" Jake's response was immediate and confident. "I've been training physically for 3 years now, sir. I run 6 miles every morning, swim competitively, and I've been studying everything I can find about military history and tactics. But, more than that, I understand what service means. My mom taught me that some things are worth sacrificing for." Michael glanced at Sarah with new interest, sensing there was more to her story than initially apparent. Something about the way Jake spoke about sacrifice and service suggested he had learned those values through experience rather than just theory. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Michael said diplomatically. "Has she shared her thoughts about your career goals?" Sarah felt both men's attention focus on her, and she chose her words carefully. "I want Jake to follow his dreams, even when they scare me. I know what military service can cost families, but I also know the pride that comes from serving something bigger than yourself." The crowd around them was beginning to thin as families headed off to celebration dinners and parties, but the three of them remained engaged in conversation. Michael found himself curious about this family, particularly about what experiences had shaped their understanding of military life. Jake excused himself to say goodbye to friends and teachers, leaving Sarah and Michael alone for the first time. The captain took advantage of the moment to ask a more direct question. "Forgive me if this seems presumptuous," Michael said, "but you speak about military service with the kind of understanding that usually comes from personal experience. Have you or your family served?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her hand unconsciously moving to adjust her dress sleeve. It was a question she had learned to navigate carefully over the years, understanding that her answer could open doors to conversations she wasn't always prepared to have. "You could say that," she replied finally.
Military families serve in different ways. Michael nodded, recognizing the diplomatic non-answer for what it was. He had learned to read people during his years of service, and something about Sarah's response suggested there were layers to her story that she wasn't ready to share with a stranger. As they continued talking, other families moved around them, parents comparing notes about their children's plans and sharing contact information for future gatherings. The atmosphere was celebratory, but Michael noticed that Sarah seemed slightly apart from it all, as if she was observing rather than fully participating in the community around her. Jake returned with several friends in tow, all eager to meet the Marine captain and ask questions about military life. Michael found himself in his element, answering questions about training, deployments, and the realities of military service. He was impressed by the thoughtfulness of the questions and the genuine interest these young people showed in understanding what they might be committing to. As the conversation continued, Michael noticed that Sarah had moved slightly away from the group, giving the young people space to ask questions they might not feel comfortable discussing in front of parents. Her consideration for Jake's independence was obvious, but there was also something guarded about the way she watched the interaction. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the auditorium windows when families finally began to disperse in earnest. Jake's friends drifted away to their own family celebrations, and the three of them found themselves alone again in the nearly empty space. "Captain Torres," Jake said formally, "would it be possible to continue this conversation sometime? I'd really like to learn more about the path from high school to special operations training." Michael pulled out his business card and handed it to Jake. "I'd be happy to discuss it further. Give me a call next week and we can set up a time to talk in more detail. I can also put you in touch with some Navy contacts who can give you specific information about SEAL programs." As they prepared to leave, Michael turned to Sarah one final time. "It's been a pleasure meeting you both. Jake is fortunate to have such a supportive mother." Sarah smiled, but Michael noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Captain. I hope you'll be honest with him about what military service really involves. I want him to make his decision with full knowledge of what he's choosing." There was something in her tone that gave Michael pause, a weight behind her words that suggested she understood the costs of military service more intimately than she was letting on. As they walked toward the parking lot together, he found himself wondering about the story behind Sarah Martinez and what had shaped her perspective on military life. The late afternoon heat hit them as they stepped outside, but none of them seemed eager to end the conversation. Jake peppered Michael with more questions about training timelines and requirements, while Sarah listened quietly, occasionally asking practical questions about support systems and family resources. As they reached the parking lot and prepared to go their separate ways, Michael felt compelled to make one final observation. "Jake, you're clearly serious about this path, and that's commendable. But remember that military service affects entire families, not just the person wearing the uniform. Make sure you and your mother have honest conversations about what this choice means for both of you." Sarah's response was immediate and firm. "We've already had those conversations, Captain. Jake knows he has my full support, whatever he decides." But, as Michael watched them walk to their car, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were still conversations this family needed to have, and stories that hadn't yet been shared. Something about Sarah's carefully controlled responses and the way she had deflected his questions about her own connection to military life suggested that Jake's interest in service wasn't as random as it might appear. As he drove away from the graduation ceremony, Michael found himself thinking about the families who supported the men and women he served with. Behind every successful military career were people who sacrificed and worried and waited, often without recognition or understanding of their own contributions. Something about Sarah Martinez reminded him of those unsung heroes, and he wondered what her story might reveal about the hidden costs of service that civilians rarely considered. The graduation ceremony was over, but Michael had a feeling that his encounter with the Martinez family was just beginning. There had been something unfinished about their conversation, questions that hadn't been asked and answers that hadn't been given. As someone whose job required him to understand and evaluate people quickly, Michael recognized when he had only seen the surface of a much deeper story. Tomorrow he would return to his regular duties at Camp Pendleton, but
he would carry with him the memory of a young man with clear goals and unwavering determination, and a mother whose quiet strength suggested she understood sacrifice in ways that few people ever would. Whether their paths would cross again remained to be seen, but Michael suspected that Jake Martinez would indeed call, and, when he did, there would be much more to discuss than just military career options. 3 days after graduation, Jake made the call that would change everything. He had spent the weekend researching Marine Corps programs and Navy SEAL requirements, creating detailed comparison charts that covered everything from training timelines to deployment schedules. His mother had watched him work with a mixture of pride and concern, understanding that her son's methodical approach to this decision reflected the seriousness with which he viewed military service. Captain Michael Torres was reviewing personnel files in his office at Camp Pendleton when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was young but determined, and Michael immediately recognized Jake Martinez despite having met him only briefly at the graduation ceremony. "Captain Torres, this is Jake Martinez. We met at the graduation on Saturday. You said I could call to discuss military career options." Michael leaned back in his chair, pushing aside the paperwork that had been occupying his attention. "Of course, Jake. I was hoping to hear from you. Have you had a chance to think more about what we discussed?" "Yes, sir, extensively. I've done additional research, and I'm more convinced than ever that military service is the right path for me. I was wondering if we could meet in person to discuss the specifics of getting started." There was something about the young man's tone that impressed Michael. Too often, potential recruits called with vague ideas about military service, attracted by movies and video games rather than genuine understanding of what they were considering. Jake sounded different, more grounded in his decision-making process. "I think that's an excellent idea," Michael replied. "When would work for you?" I should mention that these conversations are usually more productive when parents are involved, especially for someone your age. "Would your mother be able to join us?" Jake hesitated for a moment before responding. "I think she would want to be there, yes sir. She's always been very involved in my major decisions." They arranged to meet the following Tuesday at a coffee shop halfway between the base and Jake's home. Michael suggested the neutral location because he had learned that formal military settings could sometimes intimidate family members and prevent the kind of honest discussion that was necessary when making such significant life choices. When Tuesday arrived, Michael found himself looking forward to the meeting more than usual. Something about his brief encounter with the Martinez family had stuck with him, and he was curious to learn more about their story. He arrived at the coffee shop early and chose a quiet corner table where they could talk without interruption. Sarah and Jake arrived precisely on time, and Michael noticed immediately that Sarah seemed more guarded than she had been at the graduation ceremony. She was dressed professionally in dark slacks and a crisp white blouse, and her demeanor was polite but reserved. Jake, by contrast, was clearly excited about the opportunity to discuss his future in detail. After ordering drinks and exchanging pleasantries about the weather and Jake's post-graduation activities, Michael began with the standard questions he asked all potential recruits. But, as the conversation progressed, he found himself increasingly impressed by the depth of Jake's knowledge and the thoughtfulness of his questions. "I understand that SEAL training has multiple phases," Jake said, referring to notes he had brought with him. "Can you walk me through what the timeline typically looks like from enlistment to graduation from BUD/S training?" Michael explained the process, noting that Jake was asking informed questions rather than the typical inquiries about excitement and adventure that he often heard from young recruits. Sarah listened quietly, occasionally asking practical questions about family contact during training periods and support systems for families of personnel in special operations units. "Mrs. Martinez," Michael said during a pause in the conversation, "you seem very well informed about military life. Have you researched these topics, or do you have previous experience with military families?" Sarah's response was careful and measured. "I've learned what I needed to learn to support Jake's interests." When your child is passionate about something, you educate yourself about it. Michael nodded, but something about her answer felt incomplete. He had been conducting recruitment interviews for years, and he had developed a sense for when families were holding back important information. There was a quality to Sarah's responses that suggested she understood military life from something more than just research. As their conversation continued, Michael began to notice small details that reinforced his suspicion that Sarah's connection to military service was more personal than she was admitting.
She knew terminology that most civilians wouldn't be familiar with.
Her questions about deployment schedules and family support systems were specific in ways that suggested first-hand knowledge. Most tellingly, she seemed to understand the emotional and psychological challenges of military life without needing them explained. Jake, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate the kind of commitment and understanding that made Michael believe he could succeed in whatever military path he chose. The young man had clearly spent considerable time researching not just the exciting aspects of special operations work, but also the sacrifices and challenges that came with such a career choice.
Jake, Michael said, I have to ask a direct question. Military service, especially in special operations, requires complete honesty and transparency. Are there any aspects of your background or family history that you think might be relevant to your security clearance or your ability to serve? Jake looked puzzled by the question.
I don't think so, sir. I've never been in trouble with the law, my grades are good, and I don't have any financial problems or questionable associates. Michael glanced at Sarah, who had gone very still at the mention of security clearances and background investigations.
Mrs. Martinez, is there anything about your family's background that Jake should be aware of as he considers military service?
Sarah's response came after a long pause, and Michael could see her weighing her words carefully.
Every family has a history, Captain Torres.
What matters is who Jake chooses to become and how he chooses to serve. It was another diplomatic non-answer, and Michael was beginning to understand that Sarah Martinez was someone who had learned to navigate difficult conversations with skill. But her evasiveness was also creating questions that would eventually need to be addressed if Jake was serious about pursuing a military career. The conversation shifted to practical matters like fitness requirements and preparation timelines, but Michael found part of his attention focused on reading between the lines of what the Martinez family was and wasn't saying. By the time they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, he had made a decision.
Jake, I think you're an excellent candidate for military service, Michael said as they stood to go. But I want to be completely honest with you about something. Military careers require absolute transparency and trust.
If there are aspects of your family background that might be relevant to your service, it's better to address them early rather than have them discovered later during background investigations.
Sarah's reaction to this statement was immediate and noticeable.
Her posture stiffened slightly, and Michael saw something flash across her face before her controlled expression returned.
Captain Torres, she said quietly, are you suggesting that my family is hiding something that would disqualify Jake from military service?
Not at all, Michael replied carefully. I'm simply saying that openness and honesty make everything easier in the long run. Military background investigations are thorough, and they often reveal family history that applicants didn't think was relevant. Jake looked confused by the exchange, clearly not understanding why the conversation had taken this turn.
Mom, is there something I should know? Captain Torres, I don't understand what you're getting at. Michael realized he was in delicate territory.
His instincts told him that Sarah had military connections she wasn't discussing, but he couldn't push too hard without risking the trust he was trying to build with a potential recruit.
Jake, why don't you give me a call later this week?
Michael said, handing the young man his card again.
We can discuss next steps for getting your application process started.
As they prepared to part ways in the parking lot, Michael made one final attempt to understand what he was sensing from Sarah.
Mrs. Martinez, I hope I didn't overstep any boundaries in there.
It's just that in my experience, families who understand military life as well as you seem to often have personal connections to service.
Sarah looked at him for a long moment before responding. Captain Torres, I appreciate your interest in Jake's future.
But some stories are complicated, and not all of them are mine to tell. After they drove away, Michael sat in his car for several minutes, thinking about the conversation and trying to piece together what he had observed. Every instinct he had developed during his military career told him that Sarah Martinez was a woman with secrets, and that those secrets were connected to military service in some way. Over the next few days, Michael found himself thinking about the Martinez family more than he probably should have. Jake called as promised, eager to move forward with his application process, but their subsequent conversations only deepened Michael's conviction that there were important pieces of the story he wasn't getting. It was during Jake's third phone call that week that the young man inadvertently provided a clue that would change everything. "Captain Torres, I wanted to ask you about something," Jake said. "My mom has been acting strange ever since our meeting on Tuesday. She keeps asking me if I'm sure about my decision, which isn't like her. She's always been supportive of my goals."
"Strange how?"
Michael asked, his attention sharpening.
"Just different. More worried than usual, I guess.
And she's been looking at some old photo albums that she usually keeps put away. I asked her about it, but she said she was just remembering when I was younger." Michael filed this information away, along with all the other small details that didn't quite add up to a complete picture. But he was beginning to form a hypothesis about Sarah Martinez, one that would require careful handling if he was right.
The following week, Michael was reviewing application materials when his administrative assistant knocked on his door.
"Captain, there's a call for you from someone asking about background checks for family members of potential recruits. She says she met with you recently." Michael knew immediately who was calling, and he felt a mixture of anticipation and concern as he picked up the phone.
"Captain Torres? This is Sarah Martinez. I was wondering if we could schedule a private meeting to discuss some aspects of Jake's application that might require additional explanation."
Her tone was carefully neutral, but Michael could hear the tension underneath.
"Of course, Mrs. Martinez. When would work for you?" "As soon as possible. There are some things I should have mentioned earlier, and I think it's better if Jake hears them from me before they come up in his background investigation." They arranged to meet that afternoon, this time at Michael's office on base. As he hung up the phone, Michael realized that whatever Sarah Martinez was about to tell him would likely explain all the questions that had been building in his mind since graduation day. The hours until their meeting passed slowly, with Michael finding it difficult to concentrate on his regular duties. He had handled enough recruitment cases to know that family secrets could range from minor embarrassments to serious complications that could affect security clearances. But something about Sarah's carefully controlled demeanor suggested that whatever she was hiding was significant. When Sarah arrived at his office that afternoon, Michael noticed immediately that she looked different than she had in their previous meetings. Gone was the careful composure she had maintained before. In its place was the bearing of someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to face the consequences. "Captain Torres," she said as she sat down across from his desk, "thank you for seeing me on short notice. Before Jake goes any further with his military plans, there are some things about our family history that he needs to understand." Michael leaned forward, giving her his complete attention. "I'm listening, Mrs. Martinez." Sarah took a deep breath before continuing.
"What I'm about to tell you will probably surprise Jake, and it might affect his eligibility for certain types of military service. But he deserves to know the truth about where he comes from." The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Michael's office as Sarah Martinez prepared to reveal the secret she had carried for nearly 2 decades. Whatever she was about to share would change not only Jake's understanding of his family history, but also Michael's perception of the woman sitting across from his desk. "Captain Torres," Sarah said quietly, "my son doesn't know that his mother served 8 years as a Navy SEAL."
The silence in Captain Torres's office stretched for what felt like an eternity after Sarah's revelation.
Michael stared at the woman across from his desk, trying to reconcile what he had just heard with everything he thought he knew about the Martinez family. Sarah Martinez, the quiet single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her son, had been a Navy SEAL. "I'm sorry," Michael said finally, his voice careful and controlled.
"Did you just say that you served as a Navy SEAL?"
Sarah's response was steady, with none of the hesitation that had characterized her previous conversations.
"Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chen Martinez, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, served from 1999 to 2007.
I was part of the second class of women allowed into SEAL training under a pilot program that was later discontinued."
Michael's mind raced as he processed this information.
Women had not been officially allowed in SEAL training during that time period, which meant Sarah had been part of something highly classified and largely unknown to the general public. The implications of what she was telling him were staggering. "Mrs. Martinez," he said slowly, "that would make you one of fewer than a dozen women who have ever completed SEAL training."
The program you're referring to was so classified that most military personnel don't even know it existed. Sarah nodded grimly.
Which is exactly why Jake doesn't know about it, and why I've been so careful about discussing military service with him.
My entire military career is still classified at levels that most people will never see.
Michael leaned back in his chair, suddenly understanding all the small details that had puzzled him about Sarah's behavior. Her knowledge of military terminology, her understanding of deployment schedules, her careful responses to questions about family background, all of it made perfect sense now.
"How many people completed the program with you?" Michael asked, his curiosity overriding protocol. "We started with 12 women. 3 of us graduated from BUD/S training. 2 served full careers and retired normally. I left after 8 years for personal reasons."
The weight of what Sarah was sharing began to settle over Michael. He was speaking with someone who had achieved something that 99.9% of military personnel, male or female, would never even attempt. The woman sitting across from his desk had survived training that broke most of the men who attempted it.
"Jake doesn't know any of this?" Michael asked. Sarah shook her head.
As far as Jake knows, his father was military and died when he was very young.
"He thinks I've always been a civilian."
I've let him believe that because the alternative was too complicated to explain. Michael's training kicked in as he began to understand the security implications of what Sarah was telling him. "Mrs. Martinez, if your service record is as classified as you're suggesting, sharing this information with me could be
a violation of my security oaths," Sarah finished. "Yes, I'm aware of that.
But Jake is serious about pursuing SEAL training, and he's going to discover his family history during his background investigation anyway.
I'd rather he hear it from me first."
The afternoon light had shifted as they talked, casting different shadows across Michael's office. He found himself looking at Sarah Martinez with completely new eyes, seeing her not as the worried single mother he had initially perceived, but as a fellow warrior who had walked paths he couldn't even imagine.
"What was your specialty during your time with the teams?" Michael asked, using the informal term that SEALs use to refer to their units.
"Close quarters combat and explosives," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I deployed 4 times, twice to Afghanistan and twice to locations I still can't discuss."
"My call sign was Storm." Michael felt a chill run down his spine.
Even within the special operations community, certain call signs became legendary. Storm was a name he had heard whispered in the kinds of conversations that happened late at night among operators who had seen combat. If Sarah Martinez was the person behind that call sign, she was looking at a living legend.
"Storm," he repeated quietly. "I've heard that name."
Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Michael caught a flicker of something that might have been pride in her eyes.
"It was a different time.
Women weren't supposed to be doing what we were doing, so we had to be better than everyone else just to survive.
Not just physically, but politically." "What made you leave?" Michael asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. "I'm sorry, that's not my business."
"Actually, it is your business if you're going to help Jake navigate his career choices," Sarah replied. "I left because I got pregnant, and, in 2007, there was no way for a woman in special operations to continue serving while raising a child. The program I had been part of was being quietly discontinued anyway, so my departure was convenient for everyone involved."
Michael began to piece together the timeline of Sarah's life.
She had been a decorated special operations warrior who had given up her career to raise her son alone. The sacrifice involved in that decision was almost incomprehensible to him.
"Jake's father?" Michael asked carefully.
"Was also special operations. He died in a training accident when Jake was 18 months old." Sarah's voice remained steady, but Michael could hear the old pain underneath her words. "Jake knows his father died serving his country, but he doesn't know the specifics." The complexity of the Martinez family situation was becoming clearer to Michael, and, with it came an understanding of why Sarah had been so careful about revealing her background. A child of two special operations parents, especially with one parent having served in a classified program, would face scrutiny that could affect his own military career.
Mrs. Martinez, I have to ask this directly, Michael said. Are you telling me this because you want to discourage Jake from pursuing military service? Sarah's response was immediate and firm. Absolutely not.
I'm telling you this because Jake deserves to make his decision with full knowledge of what he's choosing and where he comes from. My experience doesn't define his path, but it's part of his heritage. Michael stood and walked to his window, looking out at the base that had been his home for the past 3 years. This explains so much about Jake's preparation and his understanding of military life. He's been raised by someone who lived it at the highest levels. He has all the right instincts, Sarah agreed. But he also has a romantic view of military service that comes from not understanding the real costs. I've tried to balance honoring his father's memory with being realistic about what military life actually involves. Michael turned back to face Sarah. What do you want from me? How can I help with this situation? I want you to continue working with Jake exactly as you would with any other potential recruit, Sarah replied. But I also want you to understand that when his background investigation begins, it's going to reveal things that might surprise him. I'd like your help in preparing him for that. Michael nodded, understanding the delicate balance Sarah was trying to maintain. When are you planning to tell him about your service? Tonight, Sarah said simply. I've already waited too long, and he needs to hear it from me before he hears it from a background investigator. The weight of what Sarah was facing hit Michael fully for the first time. She was about to reveal to her son that everything he thought he knew about his family was incomplete, and that his mother was someone entirely different than he had always believed. How do you think he'll react? Michael asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment before answering. I think he'll be shocked, then proud, then angry that I didn't tell him sooner. Jake doesn't like being left out of important information, and this is about as important as it gets. Michael found himself admiring Sarah's courage in facing this conversation with her son. It would have been easier to continue keeping her secrets and let Jake discover them during his background investigation, but she was choosing the harder path of honest communication. Is there anything I can do to help? Michael offered. Be available if he wants to talk to someone besides me, Sarah replied. And help me make sure that his decision about military service is his own, not just an attempt to follow in his parents' footsteps. As their meeting wound down, Michael realized that his perception of the Martinez family had been completely transformed. What he had initially seen as a typical mother-son relationship was actually something much more complex, a decorated veteran raising a son who shared her calling while trying to protect him from the burdens of her own experiences. Mrs. Martinez, Michael said as Sarah prepared to leave, I want you to know that I consider it an honor to have met you. What you accomplished during your service was extraordinary. Sarah stood and extended her hand. Thank you, Captain Torres. But remember that my service was classified for good reasons. Jake is the only person outside of official channels who will know about it, and it needs to stay that way. Michael shook her hand, noting the firm grip that spoke of years of physical training and mental discipline. You have my word. But, I have to say, Jake is incredibly fortunate to have you as a mother. I hope he still feels that way tomorrow, Sarah replied with a wry smile. Teenagers don't always appreciate learning that their parents have been keeping major secrets. As Sarah left his office, Michael sat back down at his desk and tried to process everything he had learned. The quiet single mother who worked 2 jobs was actually one of the most elite warriors the military had ever produced. The young man who wanted to become a SEAL had been raised by someone who had already walked that path and emerged victorious. Michael pulled out Jake's preliminary application materials and looked at them with new understanding. The physical fitness scores that had impressed him now made perfect sense. The maturity and understanding of military culture that had marked Jake as an exceptional candidate was the result of being raised by someone who embodied those values. But Michael also understood the challenges that lay ahead for the Martinez family. Jake's reaction to learning about his mother's service would determine not only their relationship going forward, but potentially his own military career. Some young people would be inspired by discovering such an extraordinary family legacy.
Others might feel overwhelmed by the pressure to live up to impossible standards.
As the afternoon turned to evening, Michael found himself thinking about the conversation that was about to take place in the Martinez household. Sarah was going home to tell her son that everything he thought he knew about his family history was incomplete, and that his mother was someone entirely different than he had always believed. The more Michael thought about it, the more he realized that Jake's reaction would reveal as much about his character as any background investigation could. Learning to handle unexpected information with grace and maturity was a crucial skill for anyone considering a military career, especially in special operations.
Michael's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts.
It was his commanding officer, calling about routine administrative matters. As he dealt with the standard business of military life, part of his mind remained focused on the drama that was unfolding in a modest house somewhere between the base and the local high school. By the time he finished his workday and headed home, Michael had made a decision. Whatever happened with Jake's reaction to his mother's revelation, Michael would be available to help the family navigate the complexities that lay ahead. Sarah Martinez had served her country with distinction, and now she was facing one of the hardest battles of her life, telling her son the truth about who she really was. The drive home gave Michael time to reflect on how much his understanding of the Martinez family had changed in the course of a single afternoon. This morning, he had thought he was dealing with a standard recruitment case involving a motivated young man and his supportive mother. Tonight, he realized he was working with a military family whose story was more complex and inspiring than anything he could have imagined. As he pulled into his driveway, Michael's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Captain Torres, this is Sarah.
The conversation with Jake is happening now. We'll call you tomorrow with an update. Thank you for your patience with our family."
Michael sat in his car for a moment, looking at the message and thinking about the courage it took for Sarah to face this conversation with her son. Whatever happened next, he knew that the Martinez family would never be the same. The only question was whether Jake would see his mother's revelation as a betrayal of trust or as the greatest gift she could give him, the truth about his extraordinary heritage. Jake Martinez was heating up leftover pizza when his mother walked through the front door that evening, her expression more serious than he had seen it in months. She moved with a purpose that made him pause mid-bite, recognizing the signs that they were about to have one of their important conversations. "Jake, we need to talk," Sarah said, setting her purse down on the kitchen counter with deliberate care. "There are some things about our family that you need to know before you go any further with your military plans." Jake turned off the microwave and gave his mother his full attention. Over the years, he had learned to read her moods, and something about her current demeanor told him that this conversation was going to be different from their usual discussions about his future.
"Is everything okay, Mom?
You've been acting strange ever since we met with Captain Torres." Sarah moved to the kitchen table and sat down, gesturing for Jake to join her. Between them lay the same photo albums that Jake had noticed her looking through over the past week, closed but somehow significant in their presence.
"Everything is fine," Sarah began carefully. "But there are some facts about our family history that I should have shared with you sooner. Things that might affect your understanding of yourself and your goals." Jake felt a prickle of anxiety as he sat down across from his mother. "What kind of things?" Sarah opened the top photo album and turned it so that Jake could see the pages. Instead of the family photos he expected, Jake found himself looking at military photographs, groups of people in camouflage uniforms, action shots that looked like they had been taken in combat zones, and formal portraits of soldiers in dress uniforms he didn't recognize. "I don't understand," Jake said, looking more closely at the photographs. "Whose pictures are these?" Sarah turned several pages until she found a specific photograph, then pointed to a figure in military gear. "That's me, Jake. Those are pictures from my time in the Navy." Jake stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the warrior in full combat gear with the mother who had raised him. The person in the picture looked younger, harder, and completely different from the woman he had always known. "You were in the Navy?" Jake asked, his voice filled with confusion. "But you never. I mean, you work at the medical clinic and the restaurant. When were you in the Navy?" "From 1999 to 2007, Sarah replied, watching her son's face carefully. "I left the military when you were 2 years old."
Jake's mind raced as he tried to understand what his mother was telling him.
But why didn't you ever mention this? I've been talking about military service for years, and you never said anything about serving yourself. Sarah turned more pages in the album, revealing photographs that showed her in various military settings, training exercises, formal ceremonies, and what appeared to be overseas deployments.
In every picture, she looked confident and competent, clearly at home in the military environment. My military service was complicated, Jake. I couldn't discuss it because most of what I did was classified at levels that made it impossible to share with anyone, including family. Jake picked up one of the photographs and studied it more carefully.
What did you do in the Navy?
Sarah's answer came after a long pause, and Jake could see her weighing her words carefully. I was a Navy SEAL, Jake. I served 8 years in Naval Special Warfare. The photograph slipped from Jake's hands and fluttered to the table. He stared at his mother as if seeing her for the first time, trying to process information that seemed impossible to believe.
You were a Navy SEAL?
Jake repeated, his voice barely above a whisper.
But women aren't allowed to be SEALs.
They weren't supposed to be, Sarah agreed. I was part of a pilot program that allowed a small number of women to attempt SEAL training. It was highly classified, and it was discontinued after a few years. Jake stood up from the table and began pacing around the kitchen, his hands running through his hair as he tried to understand what he was hearing.
How many people know about this? Very few. The program I was part of was so classified that even most military personnel don't know it existed.
Captain Torres knows because I told him today, and you know because you're my son and you deserve the truth. Jake stopped pacing and turned to face his mother directly.
So when I've been telling you about wanting to become a SEAL, you've been sitting there knowing that you already did it? Sarah heard the edge in her son's voice and understood that this conversation was moving into dangerous territory.
Yes, and I've been trying to figure out how to balance supporting your dreams with sharing information that I wasn't supposed to share with anyone.
What about Dad? Jake asked suddenly. Was he really military, or was that a lie too? Sarah's expression softened as she addressed what she knew was the most sensitive part of this conversation. Your father was also Special Operations, Jake. He was a SEAL too, and everything I told you about his death was true. He died in a training accident when you were 18 months old.
Jake sat back down heavily, the full weight of what his mother was telling him beginning to sink in.
So both of my parents were Navy SEALs?
Yes. We met during a joint training exercise, and we served together for 2 years before you were born. Jake was quiet for a long time, staring at the photographs spread across the table. Sarah watched him process the information, understanding that his entire conception of his family and himself was being rewritten in real time.
Why didn't you tell me sooner? Jake asked finally.
I've been preparing for SEAL training for years, and you never mentioned that you had already done it.
Sarah's answer came from years of thinking about this exact question.
Because I wanted you to make your decision based on who you are and what you want, not because you felt pressured to follow in our footsteps.
Military service has to be a personal choice, not a family obligation. Jake picked up another photograph, this one showing Sarah receiving what appeared to be a military decoration. What's this?
Bronze Star with V device for valor in combat, Sarah replied matter-of-factly.
I received it after a mission in Afghanistan in 2005.
The casual way his mother mentioned a major military decoration left Jake momentarily speechless. He had spent years researching military awards and understanding their significance, and he was looking at someone who had earned one of the military's highest honors for courage under fire.
How many missions did you go on? Jake asked, his tone shifting from confusion to genuine curiosity.
I can't discuss specific numbers or details, but I deployed 4 times during my 8 years of service. Each deployment lasted between 6 and 8 months. Jake began looking through the photographs more systematically, seeing his mother's military career unfold in pictures that documented years of service he had never known about. There were photos of her with teams of other operators, pictures from training exercises in various locations around the world, and formal shots that showed her progression through various ranks and positions. Your call sign was Storm, Jake said, reading a caption under one of the photographs.
Sarah nodded. How did you know that? It's written here under this picture. Why Storm?
Sarah smiled slightly, and, for the first time that evening, Jake caught a glimpse of the person she must have been during her military service. I had a tendency to appear in unexpected places at unexpected times during missions. My team leader said I moved through operational areas like a storm system, impossible to predict and difficult to stop. Jake found himself studying his mother's face, looking for signs of the warrior he was seeing in the photographs. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see traces of that person in the woman who had raised him, the way she carried herself, her physical fitness despite working long hours, and the quiet confidence that he had always attributed to her strength as a single mother.
Is this why you always supported my interest in the military? Jake asked. Because you understood what I was talking about? Partly, Sarah admitted. But also because I could see that you had the same calling that your father and I felt. Military service isn't just a job, Jake. It's a way of life that requires sacrifices most people can't understand. Jake was quiet for several minutes, continuing to look through the photographs and trying to reconcile everything he was learning with everything he thought he knew about his family. Are you disappointed that I didn't tell you sooner? Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Jake looked up from the photographs and studied his mother's face. I'm not disappointed. I'm just trying to understand why you thought you needed to hide this from me. Because once you know this about our family, it changes everything, Sarah replied. You can't unknow that both of your parents served in special operations. That knowledge will influence every decision you make about your own military career. Jake nodded slowly, beginning to understand the complexity of his mother's position. You were trying to protect me from feeling like I had to live up to your achievements. Exactly. I wanted you to choose military service because it was right for you, not because you felt obligated to follow our example. Jake stood up again and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where he had spent countless hours training for the physical challenges of military service. Now he understood that his mother had been watching him prepare for challenges she had already overcome. What do you think about my plans now? Jake asked. Do you think I'm ready for SEAL training? Sarah's response was immediate and certain. I think you're as ready as anyone your age can be. You have the physical preparation, the mental discipline, and the understanding of what you're committing to. But, more importantly, you have the heart for service that can't be taught. Jake turned back to face his mother. Will you help me prepare? I'll help you in any way I can without compromising the classified aspects of my service, Sarah replied. But, remember that your path through training will be different from mine. You'll face different challenges and have different experiences. Jake sat back down at the table and picked up one of the photographs showing his mother in full combat gear. Can you tell me anything about what it was really like? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and also the most rewarding. SEAL training breaks you down completely and, then, builds you back up into someone you never imagined you could become. But, it also costs you things that you can never get back. What kinds of things? Relationships, sometimes. A sense of normalcy. The ability to see the world the way civilians do. Sarah paused before continuing. But, it also gives you things that nothing else can: confidence in yourself, bonds with teammates that last a lifetime, and the knowledge that you served something bigger than yourself. Jake absorbed this information, understanding that his mother was giving him the kind of honest assessment of military service that he had been seeking for years. Do you regret leaving? Jake asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. I regret that I had to choose between my military career and being your mother. In 2007, there was no way to do both effectively. But, I don't regret the choice I made. Raising you has been the most important mission of my life. Jake felt tears sting his eyes as he understood for the first time the magnitude of the sacrifice his mother had made for him. She had given up a distinguished military career to raise him as a single parent, never once mentioning what she had given up. Mom, I'm sorry you had to make that choice. Don't be sorry, Jake. I made the choice freely, and I would make it again. But now you have your own choices to make, and I want you to make them with full knowledge of who you are and where you come from. Jake picked up the photo album and closed it, then looked directly at his mother. I still want to pursue SEAL training. But now I understand what I'm really choosing.
Sarah reached across the table and took her son's hand.
Then, I'll support you completely, just as I always have.
But remember that your success or failure in training will be your own.
You're not carrying our legacy, Jake. You're creating your own.
As they sat together in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the photographs that documented Sarah's secret military career, both mother and son understood that their relationship had fundamentally changed. The woman Jake had always known as his devoted mother was also a decorated veteran who had served her country with distinction. The young man Sarah had raised was about to follow a path she knew intimately, with all its challenges and rewards.
There's one more thing you should know, Sarah said as they prepared to put the photographs away.
Captain Torres is going to help coordinate with the Navy recruitment process, but he's also going to help us navigate the security clearance issues that come with your family background.
Jake looked puzzled. What kind of security clearance issues?
When the investigators start looking into your background, they're going to discover that your mother served in a classified program that very few people know about.
That's going to raise questions that we'll need to handle carefully.
Jake nodded, understanding that learning about his family's military history was only the beginning of a much more complex process. As they cleaned up the photographs and closed the albums, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had finally shared the truth with Jake, but she knew that the real test would come when he began to understand the full implications of his family legacy. "Jake," she said as they finished putting everything away, "I want you to think about everything we've discussed tonight. We can talk more tomorrow, but I want you to be sure that your decision about military service is still your own." Jake hugged his mother for the first time since she had begun her revelations.
"It is my decision, Mom. But now I understand why I've always felt called to serve. It's in my blood."
As they said goodnight and headed to their respective bedrooms, both Sarah and Jake knew that their family story had entered a new chapter. The secrets that had shaped their lives for 18 years were finally in the open, and now they would face whatever came next together, as a military family that understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The next morning, Jake called Captain Torres to schedule another meeting, this time with the full knowledge of who he was and where he came from. His voice was steady and determined as he explained that he was ready to move forward with his application, armed with a complete understanding of his family history and his own motivations. Captain Torres, who had been waiting for this call since his conversation with Sarah the previous afternoon, heard something new in Jake's voice, the confidence that comes from understanding your place in a larger story. The young man who had impressed him with his preparation and dedication was now also someone who understood the true weight of the commitment he was making. As Michael hung up the phone after confirming their appointment, he realized that he was about to witness something rare in his recruitment experience, a young person who was choosing military service not despite understanding its costs, but because he fully comprehended what it meant to serve. The Martinez family had given him a gift by sharing their story, and now he had the privilege of helping Jake begin his own chapter in that extraordinary legacy of service.